highlighted there. As a heads up, it would be worth knowing, and we'll flag this up in the webinar. I don't know whether you've seen a lot of narrative that's or comms coming out of the regulator in the last 24, 48 hours, but I'll post the 10 questions that we'll be referring to throughout the webinar that the regulator is asking firms to look at and to adhere to in their implementation of consumer duty. So we'll be giving that nod to all organizations or referring that in the webinar, but it's worth opening that up and having a deeper dive look at that after the webinar, but we'll be making sure that we refer to that throughout the webinar itself there. You'll also be familiar with their latest consumer duty survey, which again is in the chat there, which was published only yesterday. And that again gives you an understanding about what 1,200 firms are saying about their implementation strategies, or how far or not they're getting on with that as well.
Or indeed how honest they are.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Right. And the final one, this is not death by PowerPoint on this one there, but the final one we want to refer you to is an article based upon Emily Shepherd's reference. She's the COO at the FCA, and she basically has commented about the link between culture and consumer duty, and Adrian will be unpacking that in a bit more detail, but you can see the article that was published only yesterday on that as well. Rightio, let's get going. Well, thank you very much indeed, and thank you for attending and participating in this slightly different and nuanced webinar with colleagues at Elephants Don't Forget, where we discuss the key issues that are impacting and affecting regulated financial services firms. My name is Philip Allen, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this 60-minute webinar on consumer duty. Measure it, manage it, and evidence it. Now, today, delighted to be joined by Ben Scales. Welcome. This is his first webinar, as well. So delighted to meet you. Yes. Exactly.
Thank you, Philip. Yeah. Good morning. Good morning, everybody.
Well
referenced. People will be kind to me now.
All questions on regulatory issues, all to Ben on this one there. Oh, hot. Oh no!
Wow.
Stop it.
Ben, tell your girlfriend to log off.
I know.
And Adrian Harvey, yes, back from Glastonbury, back from prepping for Wimbledon, and all the rest of it. There, delighted to join you here today. Well,
hello. Yeah.
Well,
yeah,
I don't know whether you can get away from it, but with 1 month to go before the regulatory deadline, the regulator, as I said, mentioned at the top of the hour, highlighted 10 key questions that firms should ask themselves. And these questions should help firms, and I quote the regulator here, to reflect on their implementation of consumer duty, identifying the gaps or areas for improvements. And firms could also be expected to be asked these questions in their interactions with us. Well, in this slightly different webinar, as I said, from what you're used to, if you're a groupie of our Nelly webinars, and we're going to be asking some key questions. How do you basically get the data and the MI that your firm needs to evidence good customer outcomes? How do you identify that your staff have the skills and ability, your frontline staff, your board, your senior managers, back office staff have the capabilities and competencies to deliver the service that your customers deserve? And also, how do you basically evidence and demonstrate that to regulators? And also, how do you leverage AI to improve training and development of your people? We referred to that in last month's webinar with Lynn Hargreaves, but we're going to take a deep dive look of how you can actually practically apply and implement that within your firm. And also this one, which comes up time and time again, looking at the compliance fatigue, which we know especially fatigue around compliance training, is impacting and affecting a lot of firms. But as usual, we love to kick off with a poll. And one of the things that we love to do is to be able to get a sense check of where you are, what you're up to. And if you answer it honestly, it gets really good intelligence from where we can actually progress and move the conversation forward in the next 40 minutes that we've got together. So, question on the screen: how confident are you that all your staff will have the required understanding of their consumer duty obligations by the 31st of July? So not confident, right through to, yeah, you've nailed it. Why are you asking me this question, Philip? Yeah. So how confident are you that all your staff will have the required understanding of their consumer duty? Yeah. Too late, is it, Adrian, to shift the dial before?
Listen, so people have kindly returned to our webinar series or previously attended will have heard me say this before. 31st of July is the start. Yeah, it's not like tick done. Yeah, so the 31st of July is the start where that regulation starts to bite. And I've said this time and time again, the focus of consumer duty is culture. And it's, in my opinion, unrealistic to expect firms who've been operating in a certain way to change their culture over a period of a few months. So it's a journey. Consumer duty is a journey, and the regulator knows it, and everyone knows it. But clearly, you need to start with your staff, and we're going to deep dive into that a little bit later. But that doesn't particularly surprise me, those scores on there.
Yeah, but high confidence 6%, Ben. Fairly confident 41%. Middle of the road, somewhat confident 31%. Not confident. Thank you for your honesty. Appreciate that. 4%. Scores on the door. Thoughts on that?
I think you're right. The honesty of the people who are saying that they're struggling. In reality, we're hearing that in conversations that we speak with people in the market. It isn't all rosy, and there are people who are definitely clutching at the straws to try and cobble it together as much as they can over the next few weeks. So, yeah. Fair play for the honesty in reality, and it makes sense, doesn't it? 6%, high confidence. Again, fair play. I wonder how large those firms are as well.
That's yeah. I like that. But that chimes with what we've seen over the last 3 to 4 months. We've been doing these webinars on consumer duty each and every month, Adrian, and time and time again, firms are putting their hands up and saying, you know what, we're not at the races yet, or we're not ahead of the game, or alternatively, they're still work in progress. And that honesty is really good. But what stats on this page jump out at you, go, hang on a second, we've got to change this if we want to change the culture, the behavior, and the customer outcomes that we're delivering?
Yeah, for me, it's the culture point. I'll keep coming back to this now, like a stuck record. Yeah, so for me, it's the culture point. And this is a chat. I mean, if you think about it, if you stand back and think about it, this 44% stat, it just doesn't surprise me. I'm surprised, frankly, it's that low, because to shift the culture of an organization, to Ben's point, if it's a small organization, you get your hands around it, probably easier. But if you're talking an organization in hundreds or thousands of people, to change the culture of that organization, it's going to take a lot of time, effort, and continual application to make that happen. It's not just going to happen overnight.
And for you, Ben, which stats or data point resonates for you?
I think the 67%. People feeling probably quite nervous around the competence of their colleagues. It doesn't surprise me, because what we're hearing is so many firms are taking the age-old approach of sort of once and done type training around this, and then go back round again every year. And if you're not making it a daily conversation with your people, it really doesn't surprise me. I think actually, if you kind of narrowed that down and spoke to our customers, they're probably feeling a lot more confident around that particular question.
Yeah. So let's ask them, and let's ask them where they focus their training. Let's ask them actually where the prioritization of their training has been over the last few months, and perhaps where it needs to sit. over the next 4 weeks as well. So to date, where have your consumer duty training efforts focused on? So to date, where have your consumer duty training efforts focused on? Is it the board? Is it the consumer duty champion, frontline staff, back and middle office staff, or all staff there? And again, your answers are anonymous in this. And if you think there's other answers to this question, please post that in the chat, or actually pose a question in the Q&A speech bubbles. So today, where have your consumer duty training efforts focused on? I'm fascinated by this question and the answers to these questions, actually, because I don't think that we're actually seeing much intelligence in the marketplace about where organizations are prioritizing that. So let's have a look there. Adrian, thoughts on this?
Yeah, like you, I was really fascinated. This is the poll that I was most curious about, and I'm just digesting it really. I think the priority, I'm going to zoom in on the priority focus and say frontline staff. That's what I would expect. For me, I think the biggest challenge for firms large and small is ensuring that what's been trained, it actually translates to an in-role competence, because that's when consumer duty actually bites. Aside from the product stuff, you've taken your products that are inappropriate off the shelf, that's fine. Yeah, that's a desk-based piece of work. But on an ongoing basis, from a customer service perspective, that's where the rubber hits the road, where a customer has a conversation with one of your staff. That frontline staff, that would, in my world, should be a priority. So that's good news. I'm looking at that thing good.
I also see that's equal pegging with the consumer duty champion. Obviously, they need prep and support there. They also need support, I would argue, with what MI to scrutinize and what data to scrutinize when attestation comes in nearly next year. So they need the understanding of actually what MI am I really tracking in real time to actually get the evidence to give me the assurance, not only to myself, but also to the regulator when, as Emily said, they're going to be asking for this data.
Yeah, well, let's face it, in the previous slide, the highest stat from previous webinars has been the concern about evidence. Correct. So compliance professionals saying, and my greatest concern is how I'm going to evidence this, perhaps with a weather eye on the attestation coming up in a year's time.
Whilst we won't talk about testing outcomes, I know that's a critical point for organizations to look at. We'll be looking at that in our next webinar on testing outcomes with technology. So hold that space and hold that thought if you wanted to know, or how does Nelly address those things. We'll be looking at that next month on that. But what I wanted to do is that look at the next stage, and actually the 3 key questions that the regulator will expect you to answer. And this comes apart as a part of 10 questions that the regulator has posed only in the last 48 hours. A real encouragement for organizations who perhaps want to sense check where they are. And these are the questions that we've picked out in particular that are relevant to elephants don't forget, and that we can address and we will address in the rest of the webinar. So question 1, do you have the data and MI that you need, especially related to vulnerability? To what extent do you need to change behaviors? And if you do, how do you do that? And then the assurances that are essential, because the buck stops there, as you said, consumer duty champion, the buck stops at the consumer duty champion, that senior managers need to deploy. So with that in mind, easy to pose the question, harder to answer it, Adrian. There's still a gap, isn't there? There's still a cultural gap in terms of the MI that firms have and the MI that they want, not only about their culture, but also about their people.
Yeah, I mean, this comes up time and time again with firms expressing a genuine concern about the quality and completeness of the data they have available to them in relation to their people. And one of the things that I posed in a previous webinar, we've got a lot of comments about, which was pleasing, was the extent to which a number of firms are using customer detriment as a thermometer or a measure of whether or not they've got their governance and their consumer duty practices correct. In other words, when we get a lot of complaints, we know we've got it wrong. That feels completely at odds with the spirit of the legislation around consumer duty, which is, of course, to ensure the customers treated appropriately and fairly. So does that answer your question?
It does. Thank you. So a patchwork of evidence, Ben. Firms looking through the rearview mirror and looking at lagging indicators, not necessarily going to help them get to where they want to be, as we've depicted on the graph.
I think you're just always on the backwards foot, aren't you? And it's about how can you get ahead of the curve, and how can you see it in the windscreen as opposed to in your rear mirror. And actually being able to see where it's likely to come from, or groups of people or particular processes that you're likely to fail on where people just haven't understood it, is incredibly helpful to mitigate a huge amount of the risk that these firms are facing currently.
And you're not going to mitigate those risks, Adrian, if you're always doing what you've always done, is it? Especially around issues like vulnerability, which the regulators name-checked yet again in their 10 questions yesterday.
Yeah, I'm sure you're doing this deliberately, Philip, and teeing me up for all the things that I normally say. So thank you, because I should know it by now, and probably everyone else is bored by it. So this is what we believe, and most participants in these webinars tell us is true, is a sort of default approach to employee training and competence. And it's occurred it's morphed over time to this single point in time, we call it training and competence. And I'm sure everyone on the webinar will recognize this sort of computer-based training. It is not enjoyed by the workplace or the workforce. It's an annual refresh around whether you do it all in one go or whether you spread that pain out over the year. The concept's still the same, with some, let's be honest, dubious test of understanding at the end of the sort of training course that has very little, if any, reflection of actual understanding or competence in relation to that training material. So I would say firms are measuring the wrong thing. As it stands, most firms are measuring that something occurred. So if you think about it, I'm ticking a box and saying Adrian was trained on this day. I would argue this is irrelevant. Yeah, what you should be measuring is Adrian competent in his role, and how would you evidence that? Because that's what the regulator needs you to do. So this single point in time, and I get that you can see around the schematic there, you've got monitoring, case review, quality assurance, one-to-one coaching. These are things that are going on a day-to-day basis in most firms. However, the fundamental essence of how you ensure your people are competent, the current method, in my opinion, fails that test.
Will it achieve the outcomes that firms, the regulator, and the consumers want?
Our customers don't think so, because they've switched to a more robust solution. If the regulators, as we cited in those three highlighted questions, the regulators are looking for evidence of competence. If your measure of employee competence is the fact that Philip did a piece of training online 9 months ago and points down and said, there we are, he's competent. The data point that I would offer up is when we socialize our technology for the first time in an organization, on average, we do more than 100 million interventions a year. On average, the level of competence of an employee using the customer's own content is 54%. So this is not about catching people out. This is using the customer's own training content, assessing those employees, and the average score is 54%. So does it work? No, the current approach does not work, or we would be seeing a much higher score.
I think the thing that firms struggle with as well is understanding where that 54% is. So
yes, good point.
Who are the people, and what is the material that is the issue? And it goes back to that lag indicator element that where your failings regularly are, but it's so difficult to go, this is what Ben truly has managed to retain from the material and has failed to.
So when you said that, Ben, all I'm thinking about, remember Where's Wally? When you're trying to identify where Wally is there, and you're going, where is it breaking down? What's happening in our people where that is actually going to cause customer detriment, where that's going to cause foreseeable harm? And actually pinpointing that is critical, because as we put on this slide, there's 3 key elements, Adrian, that firms have got to get right if they are to actually make sure that they fulfill their obligations and to consumer duty, but also take the fuzziness out of culture, rather than this mythical, thing where we can't quite get our hands around, we can't understand it. It's defined by the big 4 as this or that by that. Actually, we can break it down into 3 things, can't we?
Yes, for me, people, culture, and the data and MI associated with that. But if you look at the schematic, I just want to bring this to life a little bit. So if you look at those cross-cutting rules, and I'm thinking about products and services, I'm thinking most of the firms on the webinar are looking at that and saying we've done that work. Price and value, you've probably done that as well. And there may be outliers saying we haven't, or we're not satisfied with what we've done. But in principle, most firms will be saying those two segments, we've done that, we've got that covered. What we're hearing is the difficult stuff is ensuring consumer understanding and ensuring that the customer support post-sale, the post-sale customer support, is to the standard required by the regulation. And just to bring a point out, you did say I was going to deeper dive on that Emily Shepherd quote. She made a comment that we captured, which I particularly like. And what she said was, culture is not just a slogan on your website, it is the very essence of what your organization stands for, embodied by how it conducts itself. I thought it was a really nice, it's a nice quote, and for me, it's reflective of the high standard that the regulator is expecting. This is not a low ball standard. They are saying we want this absolutely top notch, and that's a really big. I think it's a really big challenge for organizations. How are you going to evidence that? Ben will tell you that we can help you. But I think right now, it's what I hear. I speak to firms every day. It's what I hear again and again and again. Yeah,
absolutely. You can't just say, get it done, Ben, on this one. So how do we help and support firms? A number of questions posed in the chat, which we'll come to definitely. So keep those questions coming, and we'll tackle them when we can there. Ben, how do we help firms? How do we support firms? How do they go forward?
I think that the first thing to touch on is making this regular and making this a daily conversation with every single employee. So our piece of technology, it requires a minute of an employee's time per day. So it's incredibly light touch and isn't distracting for the organization, but it's very simple, highly effective. And it enables firms to be able to see precisely where the risk sits within their business, irrelevant of the fact that everybody's gone through the training and got the tick in the box at the end of it. But it shows you at an individual employee level or a process level, you have a challenge with this particular thing. And that's incredibly helpful to shine the light and the focus on where things are likely to go wrong. But it goes a few steps further than that, and we'll kind of get into the meat of it as we go through. But I guess on the screen, there's just a few of the benefits, if you like, of what we call a continual assessment model. It is continually assessing the competence of the organization, constantly reinforcing the key messages that needs to be landed with the people. And naturally, as things change and stuff happens in an organization and the new fire appears somewhere, it's nice and agile to be able to address those things that you hear as you go through the process. So to Adrian's point of 31st of July is only the start of this, there's going to be endless challenges and problems that come out in the wash over the next few months. And it's about being able to pivot, in my opinion, to address those new issues that you see arising, which we don't even know are actually going to happen yet.
Okay. Good. So how does it all work then?
Before
So
you do
you want to jump in?
I think that's a key point that you make there. It's the ability, for firms to see evidence, management information that says we have got a problem in this area. And if you look at the current default model for employee training and competence, that data doesn't exist. All of our customers have that forward-facing risk radar to say, right now, this is the biggest challenge that you've got in this specific group of employees.
And why wouldn't you? Because the onus is on firms to actually act and anticipate where potentially foreseeable harm could impact on that customer journey at every touch point on that customer journey for every product and service. So that's a tall ask for many firms to do.
I agree. Normally on these webinars, we get a subject matter expert in to basically shore us up, Philip, because we need it. So on this webinar, we've got a subject matter expert, and that's Ben, and he's going to talk us through. No pressure, Ben.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, the key to this is in that final box, and it starts with sustained behaviour change. That is where we want to get to. People operating and behaving in the way that the firms really need them to. How we get there takes a little bit of time. So this is not a silver bullet, quick solution to all problems, but it is simple. So our piece of tech, which is called Clever Nelly, is an AI-powered tool which continually assesses the competence of the workforce. In the first instance, what you really need is a diagnostic of exactly what our people do and don't know across the suite of required learning, consumer duty obviously being one of those. Tell me where the knowledge is and where the gaps exist. And the tool taps into some really effective learning techniques: spaced learning, repetition, and testing. They are proven as the most effective ways of learning and retaining information on an ongoing basis. So people will receive questions. They can engage with the tool through email, app. Microsoft Teams is probably our most common way now. And we start off simply asking people a couple of questions a day, and we collate their responses. We then start to move into what we call the knowledge phase, which is about closing the gaps that we identify. So we work out that Philip is really struggling in relation to vulnerable customers. He's great at AML, but vulnerable customers he's struggling with. And so we start to change the way that we work with each person to focus in on the subjects and the processes and the policies that they're struggling with the most. And we increase the knowledge in those areas. And that's helpful to firms to have been able to say, we started off at 54% and now we're at 80% knowledge across the business. But actually what you're after is competent employees who've been able to translate that theoretical knowledge into the conversations that they're having with their customers. So we start to introduce more contextualized questions, assessing somebody's judgment, somebody's ability to apply knowledge in a real life scenario that's relevant to them. This is what starts to increase the competence of the workforce. And that translates into the behavioral change and the performance uplift that you want within your people.
Ben, who writes these questions?
Us, primarily. So certainly in the first instance, we will take the customer's training material, whether that's e-learning, policies, PowerPoints, whatever. We've got teams of experts who identify what's the key learning point that we're trying to achieve on this slide. Create a question, plausible, incorrect responses. So we're not just steering people to the right answer, because that is just pointless and disrespectful to the employee. And frankly, some of the e-learning modules that you see in the assessments at the end of those can be really quite, don't have the word to use to describe it, but poor is probably polite.
It's a PG, by the way, this webinar.
Yes, yeah, indeed. So yeah, we will do that. However, where we start to get to that third and fourth phase, where you're really trying to help somebody apply the learning, this is where the customer will start to join the party and create some of those questions as well.
And how difficult is it to implement? Because everyone's thinking this is going to be a nightmare.
Easy. We ask our customers 9.1 out of 10, is it? Our current ease to implement score. That's across don't know, 40 or so implementations. So it's simple. We've got a proven process. We hold your hand throughout it. And if you follow the model, you'll be up and running in 4-6 weeks.
So when we talk about meeting consumer duty obligations, primarily, are we talking about compliance to that obligation and adherence to that? Or are we talking?
It's certainly one element that we help firms with. Yeah, I kind of break it down to there's 3 pillars of how our customers will use the technology. One is around evidence compliance to a way higher standard. Because currently, there's tactical activities going on to assess application and call listening and things like that. But this gives you daily evidence that your people are genuinely competent in role, which is way more robust than what most firms currently have access to. So evidence in compliance is a core area. The risk element is a big piece as well. Switching it on its head. Risk leaders love the data that you see out of this, because you've switched the lights on before the issues have manifested in most instances. So it provides you with a leading indicator. And then this is not just a compliance tool. This can be used to drive performance within the organization and actually increase the operational performance of the business.
Just talk to those purple boxes, Ben, because I think a lot of people, I hear constantly from compliance professionals saying they're starved of budget. Yeah. So inevitably, our product isn't free. So where's the payback? How do I even justify additional expenditure?
An easy win, if anyone's got a CPD requirement, 4 hours gained within the flow of work. It takes a minute a day to engage. So you've just bought yourself 4 hours of CPD, technically for free, by using the tech. The other one, which requires, it will change by customer, but certainly a reduction in the amount of time that you spend taking the refresher training. Because if you're proving competence on an ongoing basis across the year and have actually got 365 ticks in the box, why would you down tools and get somebody to redo a refresher training that's not relevant to us? We've got some customers who will distill the refresher training down to a 5-minute refresh or a 5-minute freshen up on the changes of policies and processes that have happened. So there's a massive economic benefit from using the tech by getting productive time back to the business. And let's be honest, generally speaking, people don't respond overly well to the mandatory refresher trainings that they have to go through when they're computer based.
Mm-hmm. And it is not just a compliance tool that, or a risk tool though. There's a bigger picture here, and one that I noticed, well, internal audit would love, certainly consumer duty champions would value, especially when they have to do their board attestations next year. And also for those senior managers where under the conduct rules, they are accountable for consumer duty implementation, execution, and maintenance.
Yeah, and I think we've got a couple of case studies, haven't we, as we sort of go further through some of the slides. But you're absolutely right, Philip. It isn't just a compliance tool, and frankly, firms who are using this just as a compliance tool are missing a massive opportunity to harvest a lot of return on investment from the tech, because your people don't just need to know, it sounds stupid, but your people don't just need to know the mandatory learnings. They need to know how to serve their customers, what their products look like, how to handle difficult conversations, how to sell their products. And businesses will invest a huge amount of training in their and money in the training of their people. And we can focus the AI towards other training materials that improve service levels, accelerate speed to competence, increase sales productivity, all by ensuring that they are competent in those processes, policies, etc., to be able to perform optimally. And to Adrian's point around return on investment, this is where it just ratchets through the roof. So we often speak to customers in the first instance around compliance in reality, But actually what happens is the conversation pivots as we look to build a business case for the tool by starting to pull down on operational leaders to say, look, imagine if your people were more competent in the products that they were selling, isn't that going to drive a lot of additional value for you?
Let's look at 3 case studies in particular, Ben. This one focuses on consumer support, consumer understandings before and after the sale. That's a key point to avoid sludge practices that the regulator has noted, and also consumer outcomes, which are always shifting, especially in the cost of living crisis in a post-COVID environment. Absolutely imperative that firms get it right there. It's also a competitive advantage, isn't it?
Indeed. Well, I mean, from an efficiencies point of view, in this instance, Moneybarn, 4.5% reduction in their average handle time within their contact centre is worth a phenomenal amount of money to them. So this is not just about getting people to get to the right outcome for a customer. This can be a way of delivering financial gain to the organisation whilst significantly improving the experience of the customer and adhering to regulation.
I'd zoom in on the 38% reduction in average hold time, because hold time is a measure of customer dissatisfaction. If I'm left on hold, I'm far more likely to complain than if I've got the ability to get through to somebody and at least discuss whatever my issue is.
Just a reference point to both of you here in the chat. Claire's mentioned this. Can you differentiate the questions, level of knowledge tested between, for example, frontline staff and all staff?
Yes, absolutely. So we break it out so you can see across subject matter, across team, all the way down to an individual employee and an individual question that you've asked them. So you can get as granular as you like with the data, all the way up to a very holistic viewpoint that says, how engaged is our workforce?
Okay. A key focus of the regulator's expectation has been, actually even prior to Consumer Duty, has been the focus on vulnerable customers and as a key segment market, because that is very much a litmus test, isn't it, of your culture, how competent your staff are. And in the public eye, it's a reputational issue as well as actually a service issue.
Yeah, I mean, vulnerable customers is, in my opinion, it's one of the hardest elements of a frontline employee, whether they're an advisor, whether they're a contact centre worker. You are expecting and requiring your people to take a judgment in a situation. Nobody speaks to you and says, hey, I'm Ben, I'm vulnerable. You're expecting your people to pull down and hear all those nuanced points that somebody makes in a conversation to go, okay, I've got one. And then you need to operate in a particular way to serve them. And that requires a huge amount of competence from an individual, especially when you start to look at the amount of attrition that exists in organizations, the amount of new people that are coming into these firms. It's a really difficult subject to grasp and be able to operate in line with.
So vulnerability identification. Sorry, Adrian, go on.
No, I was just going to say, so ordinarily we our customers very helpfully allow us to quote their details. The reason that we included this particular use case, which is subject to customer approval at this point in time, is because of the vulnerability point, you know, the 42% improvement in vulnerable customer competence. It was just so relevant and germane to this webinar that we decided to put that in. I mean, this is one of our, we trade with 8 of the top 10 UK GIs, so that's one of those who helpfully is sharing that data with us.
And just talk us through the importance of speed to competency, getting your people up to the level of expectation and the standard, especially 4 weeks ago. It's quite telling where we're talking about Consumer Duty implementation, that getting your people up to a level of competency and evidencing it is going to be critical for firms going forward, not just to the 31st of July, but thereafter.
Yeah, I mean, it's the tool is very helpful with new employees joining the organisation, because naturally, joining a business, you are consciously incompetent, you're calling out for the help, you don't know where the toilets are, you don't know how to operate the food canteen, you just need support. So we can treat those people very differently. So whereas normally we might only interact with somebody 2 to 3 times per day, actually a new person joining the organisation, we can really ramp up the level of support that we give them, and we can accelerate the speed to competency. So Age Partnership, great example, equity release firm, a 30% improvement in their speed to competency was a 4-week difference in the amount of time that it takes somebody to reach what they class as a proficient advisor. And again, that in itself is worth a huge amount of money to firms, because you're massively shortening the speed to contribution cycle.
Well, we've I was interviewed by a journalist last week looking at this thing, to use a modern phrase, this thing that is a reality, and a lot of firms are talking to us about it, and that is the attrition of employees in the first 180 days of joining a firm. And a lot of this attrition is attributable to employees feeling that they don't have the necessary skills and competence to do the job that they've been employed to do. And this is exacerbated by hybrid working, with the employee working from home for perhaps 3 out of 5 days, where the peer-to-peer sort of support that would exist pre-COVID doesn't exist. So the employee themselves are feeling vulnerable and exposed, and we're seeing some really high levels of attrition in firms. So the obvious solution to that is to change your approach to ensuring those employees get competent, and get them as competent and confident in their role as quickly as possible. And if not, at least understand where they're struggling, so that you can pointedly provide coaching and assistance that's evidence-based rather than just generic.
Just one other thing to kind of call out, and it was on one of the previous case studies, and it I think the number was 180 odd thousand. And in that instance, that's the amount of interactions we've had with people within that organisation. And when we meet our customers and we play back this insight and data to them, the amount of touch points that we have with their people is the thing that surprises me most. Because there is no way that you can have that many conversations with your people around the key processes that they need to operate in line with, because your team leaders have got 10 people, quality assurance are looking after hundreds if not thousands. You need to harness technology to be able to have that degree of interactions with the individuals within the organization. And it's probably important to note that those interactions are personalized to each and every single one of those individuals.
Definitely, I would agree with that entirely. Couple of questions in the chat, if you wouldn't mind, panelists are looking at. And there, one observation, keyboard warrior with 2 fingers, it takes a bit of time, but we're here all night, but so we'll crack on with that. Ben, talk us through, these are some of the key brands that you are as an organization are working with and through there. You've listed 3 key takeaways there. There has to be a recognition from the get-go that things can be done differently. So the culture of the organization has to say, hang on a second, they have to ask a better question, don't they, before they even engage with Nelly? They have to recognize that there's an issue.
Yeah, 100%. And you've got to accept that you're going to have to do things differently, and that is going to feel very different as well. So historically, you were maybe spending an hour each month doing a mandatory learning course with the business, and now you're flipping that on its head and you're taking a minute of everybody's time every day. And that is a cultural shift for an organization. However, if you take that step, the benefits massively outweigh the kind of the shift, because you are now doing, you now got that daily evidence piece, which is just, I think the other thing to note is on the screen is the there's a lot of very large organizations there. And actually, this is not a piece of technology that solely focuses on big businesses. So for those firms that are 25, 50, 100, 200 people, this works exactly the same way for you, and you see equal benefit from it. Because that's one thing that we have to be careful of, that you kind of zone in on this sounds like a tool for a big organization.
Yeah, it's a good point, Ben. And I think a point to make is for smaller firms, we generally refer to sort of SME market firms, they actually get to harvest productivity and performance benefits of Nelly much faster, because by default, it's much easier to corral the people, than it is across a firm of maybe 5,000, 10,000 people. So you're going to get quicker economic payback as a SME mid-market firm. It's more agile.
Absolutely, and it's worth noting that the scale of firms that you're working with, and also the depth to which you're working with those firms across all regulatory compliance issues. You've referred financial crime as one, vulnerability is another, consumer duty and complaint handling. And having core competencies across the whole of the business, nuance to the expectations of both the regulator as well as the people themselves and the firms themselves there. Can I just refer you to, as you know, thank you very much for participating in our final poll, which asked the questions, if you do want to know more about how Nelly can support you implement and embed consumer duty, fantastic, great. And also access certainly our consumer duty hub, which has got a number of resources available there. I know that a number of questions have come in. I'm wondering if we could address those before our time is up there. One particular point is referring to, no, we recognize it's not necessarily new in terms of like your reference point. I think somebody said anonymously about vulnerability, but we would argue that consumer duty is a higher standard and a higher expectation for organizations to reach and achieve. And the regulator time and time again has, over the last year, said that it expects a cultural shift within organizations. And I think that's worth knowing, hence why our response in the form of our webinar series on consumer duty. But Ben, Adrian, do you want to just address some of the questions that people have raised?
I'm looking at an anonymous attendee who posted a question, and the final point: vulnerable customers are already supported, and the duty is not innovating new. Hey, it's not for me to say, but I'm not sure the regulator agrees with you. If they did, I'm not sure they'd be sending out quite so many Dear CEO and like associated communications. So, you know, you're obviously entitled to opinion. I've got mine, and the regulator has theirs. So I think the only opinion that really matters in this equation is the regulators.
Other questions that people have posed there. I don't know if you can look through those as well there. I noticed that you've answered a couple of those already there. But one about data and MI split, Adrian, that's worth knowing, because I think that people will forensically want to know how they can evidence particular data to evidence either whether outcomes, consumer outcomes are being achieved or they're not. And also, once they've got those two touch points, how do they close that gap?
Yeah, I think that most of our customers are taking a feed out of Nelly. Yeah, so they're taking data out of Nelly because we are not a single source of truth. Customers will have their own single source of truth. So they're using Nelly data to augment existing governance and reporting structures within their business. So the data, generally speaking, is a unique feed of data. So most customers would look at Nelly data and say, we've never seen anything like that before. That's fantastic. What they then do with it varies by customer. Some customers use that to put into people-based systems. Others use it as part of risk management type operations. So yeah, all the MIs there, you can cut it however you want.
But what's interesting about this is that, you know, it doesn't, the regulator doesn't imply that you should have new data sources. But I think that goes back to your point, where there is a higher expectation on firms or a greater expectation. Therefore, firms need to explore, don't they? They need to say, hang on a second, they need that honesty chat that Ben talked about within the organization to say, do we have it? Do we have it from the data pool? Do we have the right data? Not the quantity of data, but the right data to interrogate and scrutinize. And what we're saying is that Elephants Don't Forget has that MI from the data that reveals the risks that could actually impact on customer outcomes. And that in your armory is better than not having sight of anything. You don't want to be caught out, whether it's in 4 weeks' time or whether it's in a year's time.
The regulator has said, do not rely on your existing sources of data. Yeah, you need to find new sources of data to evidence that you are complying with consumer duty. So, and in our world, I get it's a broad church, right? Consumer duty, but in our world, we focus in on the employee and the quality, yeah, and the timeliness of data in relation to employee competence, and that's just one component of Clever Nelly. Look, to be honest, Philip, I'm delighted that we've had so many people attend this webinar, and would give them some time back.
Definitely. And if you want to reach out, we've got the details there. Where you can check us out on the website there, access our materials and our resources there. Ben, I think you've done jolly well. We'll ask you back in 2025 for you to come back again. Yeah, just need to polish up on a few things, and I've got a great tool that you can use, you can deploy.
Someone's asked, how do you subscribe? You can go onto our website and click and subscribe on our website.
Yes.
In terms of receiving updates and being invited to podcasts. So there you go.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. It's been fantastic. And look, if you enjoyed it, stay tuned for next month where we've got MI technology. Stop giving yourself emojis, Ben.
And your girlfriend's on again. She's loving it.
Yeah,
your first webinar. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Let's give our audience 9 minutes back in the diary as well. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.